The hook lands hard in the first seconds. Damon Cross stands at the center of a ballroom packed with colleagues, investors, and board members, people who built careers on reading rooms, and he opens his mouth and ruins everything. "You've been dragging me down for 5 years," he says, loud enough that the string quartet stops playing. "I want a divorce, tonight, right here, so everyone in this room understands I'm moving forward, without dead weight." Celine Vale doesn't cry. She doesn't raise her voice. She sets down her champagne glass, smooths the front of her dress with both hands, and turns toward the exit like she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. The ballroom doors explode open before she reaches them. 8 armored black SUVs lock the exits. Security guards, trained ex-military, men who'd put senators on the floor for walking too close, step back without a word. The crowd parts. The chandeliers hum overhead in the sudden silence. Lucien Moretti walks in. He's not what people imagine when they picture fear. He doesn't carry a weapon visibly. He doesn't shout. He removes his leather gloves one finger at a time, hands them to the man at his left shoulder, and crosses the marble floor in 12 unhurried steps. Then he stops in front of Celine, looks at her, just her, like no one else exists in this room, and drops to one knee. The room doesn't breathe. If you've ever watched someone discover that everything they believed about their own life was wrong, you know what Damon Cross's face looked like in that moment. Subscribe to this channel and drop a like before we go further. And tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. What happens next will make your jaw drop. The first thing you need to understand about Celine Vale is that she was never who Damon thought she was. And that was entirely by design. She'd moved into his orbit 6 years earlier at a law firm's holiday function, quiet as weather changing, introduced by a mutual contact whose name Damon couldn't remember 3 months later. Celine wore no jewelry that night, ordered water, asked him 2 questions about his work, and listened to his answers with the kind of attention most people only pretend to have. Damon had been so accustomed to women performing interest that genuine attention disarmed him completely. They dated for 8 months before he proposed. She said yes without fanfare. The wedding was small, her side of the guest list thin enough that Damon noticed but never asked about it. She'd explained it simply. She'd grown up moving around, lost touch with most people. He accepted that. It matched the rest of her, contained, self-sufficient, asking for nothing. What he told himself, and what was true, were 2 different things. What was true? Celine was careful. Every day of their marriage, she was careful. She chose an apartment in a mid-rise building instead of the penthouse Damon could have afforded. She drove a sedan with no custom plates. She kept her hair a different length than she'd worn it before. She worked as a paralegal under her mother's maiden name at a firm small enough that no one photographed the staff for press releases. She lived, deliberately and without complaint, inside a life designed to be overlooked. Damon never saw any of this. He saw a woman with no ambition who made no demands and didn't push back when he worked until midnight 3 nights running. He saw a woman who cooked when he forgot to eat and said, "It's fine," every time he canceled plans. He built a story about her in his head, soft, dependent, grateful. And once a man builds that story, almost nothing will shake it loose. He was wrong on every count. But we'll get to that. The night of the gala, Damon had been drinking since 4 in the afternoon. Not visibly. Not to anyone who didn't know him, but Celine knew. She'd watched him put away 2 bourbons before they left the apartment, his jaw doing that tight thing it did when he was anxious about his appearance in a room full of people he considered rivals. There was a presentation that evening. 3 board members he'd been courting for 18 months would be there. He needed to look like a man with no soft edges. She'd said nothing on the ride over, just sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the city slide past the window. In the ballroom, she'd positioned herself at the edge of conversations rather than the center, the way she always did, close enough to catch what Damon needed, far enough to stay unmemorable. She'd watched him shake the right hands, laugh at the right moments, cut the right people short. He was good at this. She'd always known that about him. Ambition of his particular kind required a specific social intelligence, and Damon had it in abundance. What he lacked was proportion. The shift happened around 9:30. She saw it in the set of his shoulders before she heard it in his voice. He'd been talking to Raymond Kells, one of the 3 board members, silver-haired and soft-spoken. The kind of man who made decisions by going quiet rather than by speaking. And something had gone sideways. Damon's neck had gone red above his collar. His hands came up, a gesture he used when he was over-explaining. She'd started moving toward him. Slowly, not to draw attention, just to be close in case he needed her to redirect the conversation. She'd done it before. She knew the moves. She didn't get there in time. 5 years, Damon said, and his voice was too loud, the room already slowing its noise to hear him. 5 years I've been carrying the same weight, and people keep asking me why I haven't moved faster. You want to know why? He turned, found her with his eyes across 8 feet of marble floor. Because some of us are dragging other people along who can't keep up. Celine stopped walking. The room stopped too. Not all at once, but in the spreading quiet way rooms go still when they sense something real is about to happen. I want a divorce, Damon said. He wasn't shouting. That was almost worse. His voice was measured, deliberate, the kind of voice a man uses when he's decided something and wants witnesses. Tonight. Right here. So everyone in this room understands what I'm doing and why. I'm moving forward, without dead weight. Celine did not cry. That's the first thing anyone who was there would tell you later. She didn't cry, didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice or her hands. She looked at him for exactly 4 seconds, which in a silent ballroom feels like a very long time. Then she set her champagne glass on the tray of a passing server, smoothed the front of her dress with both palms, and turned toward the door. Raymond Kells stepped back. Someone near the bar made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Damon watched her walk away and felt something he'd later describe as satisfaction, which tells you everything you need to know about where he was that night. The doors blew open at 9:47 p.m. Not literally. They didn't break, weren't damaged. But when both of the main ballroom's oak doors swung wide at once and the draft hit the chandeliers, every flame in the room jumped and the crowd lurched backward like something had detonated. The 8 SUVs were already there when people looked toward the windows. Black, no plates visible, idling in formation around the building's main entrance with a precision that looked practiced because it was. The door staff had evaporated. The security detail that Hartley Enterprises paid 6 figures a year to stand at this event had rearranged themselves. Not fled, just repositioned, moving to the walls, hands visible, making themselves very deliberately absent from whatever was about to happen. Lucien Moretti entered through the main doors. He was 51 years old, which surprised people who expected someone harder looking, someone scarred. His face was composed in the particular way of men who've had a long time to decide what to show and what to keep behind their eyes. He wore a gray suit, no tie, a collar button undone, the studied casualness of a man who'd never needed to dress for approval. He was not large in the movie sense. He was present in a way that made large men feel the room shrink. He peeled his leather gloves off one finger at a time, handed them to the man at his left shoulder, who took them without looking, the unconscious reflex of someone who'd done it before, and walked across the marble floor. People moved. Not because anyone told them to, they just moved. Celine had stopped midway to the door when she heard the quiet. A different quiet than the one Damon had made. That one had been awkward, charged with social embarrassment. This one had weight to it. She turned. She saw him. And something in her face changed. Not fear. Damon would pick this apart later, running the memory over and over. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to recognition. The expression of someone who is prepared for a moment they hoped wouldn't come and now has to decide what to do with it. Lucien crossed the last 8 feet and stopped in front of her, looked at her, only her, with the kind of focus that costs something, and went down on one knee. Not with ceremony or drama, just smoothly, like a man lowering himself before something worth the effort. The room had stopped breathing. Behind him, the man with his gloves stood still. The enforcers at the door stood still. The string quartet had their instruments at their sides. Raymond Kells had his hand over his mouth. Damon Cross stood 11 feet away and felt the floor tilt under him. Lucien spoke. His voice was low enough that most of the room caught fragments rather than sentences, but the few people near enough to hear it would describe it the same way afterward. He spoke the way men speak when they've been waiting to say something for a long time. He said, "I've been looking for you." Celine looked down at him, Her jaw worked once, a small private movement. Then she said quietly, "You weren't supposed to find me." "I know." He rose. "But I did." Damon Cross said loudly, "What the hell is this?" The man with the gloves turned and looked at him. Just looked. Damon stopped talking. There are moments in a person's life when the entire architecture of what they believed becomes visible for what it is. A structure they built themselves, out of assumptions and convenience, without checking the ground underneath. Damon was standing in the middle of one of those moments. He didn't recognize it yet. He was still in the phase where the brain insists there's an explanation that fits the old story. That if he looks hard enough, the familiar shape of things will reassemble. He watched Celine and Lucien Moretti leave the ballroom together. She didn't look back. He stood there with 140 people around him and felt, for the first time in a very long time, genuinely alone. The next 12 hours were not kind to him. He tried calling her. She didn't answer. Not the first time, not the seventh. He went home to an apartment that still smelled like her and sat on the couch in his gala clothes and drank 2 more bourbons, slower this time, trying to arrange the evening into something that made sense. He kept arriving at the same problem. The security guards, trained ex-military, men who charged Hartley Enterprises $30,000 a month and had never stepped back from anything. They'd moved for Lucien Moretti without being told, which meant they knew exactly who he was and what it would cost not to move. By 2 in the morning, Damon had made enough phone calls to understand the name. Lucien Moretti, 51, born in Providence. No criminal convictions, nothing that had stuck. 3 federal investigations, all concluded without charges. Known associates across 5 states. A legitimate real estate portfolio that served as the public face of something significantly less legitimate. Referred to in certain circles, circles Damon was only now discovering existed adjacent to his own life, as the most disciplined operator on the East Coast. Not the most violent, the most controlled. Damon poured a 3rd drink and didn't touch it. The question that kept surfacing, the one he couldn't route around. Why had Celine's face, when she'd turned and seen that man cross the marble floor, looked like the expression of someone who'd been bracing for something a long time? Not surprise, not recognition in the way you recognize a stranger's face from a photograph. Something deeper and older than that. The face of a woman who knows. He called his investigator at 2:30 a.m. Marcus Reed, ex-law enforcement, careful, expensive, someone Damon had used twice before for business-related background checks. He kept it simple. He needed everything on Celine. Before she was Celine Vale. Before the law firm and the sedan and the quiet dinners. He needed to know who she'd been. "That could take time," Marcus said. "I'll pay for speed," Damon said. Marcus called back at 6:15 in the morning, and his voice had changed. Not alarmed, Marcus didn't do alarmed, but flattened, careful. "I've hit 3 dead ends in the last 4 hours," he said. "Clean dead ends. Not missing information, removed information. Somebody went back through this woman's history and pulled things out. And they did it well." "What does that mean?" "It means wherever she came from, someone with significant resources didn't want it on the record." A pause. "Damon, I need you to tell me how important this is to you." "What kind of question is that?" "The kind I ask before I keep pulling on something that somebody else clearly wanted left alone." Another pause. "There are names adjacent to the gaps. I can't fill the gaps, but I can see the edges of them. And some of the names at the edges are names I don't go near without a reason." Damon gripped the phone. "What names?" Marcus said one name, the same name Damon had spent the night learning. The bourbon glass left a ring on the table. Damon stared at it. "Keep going," he said, "whatever it costs." "I'll need a different answer from you first," Marcus said. "Do you want this because you need to understand what happened, or because you're planning something? Because those are different jobs, and I'm only taking one of them." Damon thought about Celine's face in the ballroom. That 4-second look she'd given him before walking away. Not fury, not grief. Something almost like pity. "Understanding," he said, though he wasn't sure it was entirely true. Marcus sent him 3 things by noon. A photograph, a redacted document with visible fragments, and an address. Not Celine's current location, but a place she'd lived 11 years earlier under a different name, in a city Damon had never heard her mention. The photograph was Celine, clearly, her bone structure, her eyes. But she was younger, maybe 26, 27, and she was wearing clothes that cost more than anything she'd owned in the 6 years Damon had known her, standing in front of what looked like a private jet's boarding stairs. Not posed. Candid. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was looking at something beyond the frame's edge, and her expression was the same composed watchfulness she wore every day, but unguarded in a way she'd never let Damon see. The redacted document had a header that was mostly blacked out. What was visible? A date, 11 years ago, and a fragment of a line near the bottom that read, "Subject's testimony was instrumental in preventing further casualties. Location of subject subsequently classified at subject's request." Damon read it 4 times. He thought about the 6 years, the sedan, the mid-rise building, the job at a firm small enough to stay out of the news. He thought about the way she'd always declined to attend his higher-profile public events, the small excuses she'd make, headache, work deadline, fatigue, and how he'd been quietly grateful each time because she didn't fit easily into those rooms. He told himself it was because she wasn't sophisticated enough. He was beginning to understand, with the particular nauseating clarity of a man whose assumptions are dismantling in real time, that she had been protecting both of them, without his knowledge, without his consent, and without any expectation that he'd ever know or thank her for it. Meanwhile, across the city, in a building with no name on its exterior and windows that didn't open, Celine sat across a table from Lucien Moretti and did not make it easy for either of them. "How long have you known where I was?" she said. He considered lying. She saw him consider it. She'd always been able to read him, which was partly why she'd run. 14 months, he said. "And you waited." "I was trying to decide whether to tell you." He folded his hands on the table. They were careful hands. Celine had always noticed that. The hands of a man who chose his movements. "I knew you'd built something. I didn't want to walk through it. But you came to that ballroom." "I came to that ballroom," he agreed, "because I watched what he did to you on the live feed from my car, and I made a decision." Celine said nothing for a moment. Then, "That wasn't your decision to make." "No," he said. "It wasn't." He didn't look away. "I'm not sorry I made it." She exhaled slowly through her nose, looked at the table. The room had a faint hum to it, climate control, or something electrical in the walls. "They're going to know," she said. "If they haven't already, whoever had eyes on that ballroom is going to start asking questions, and the questions are going to lead back." "I know. I had 11 years. I know, Celine." She looked at him then. Really looked. Not the composed surface she showed the world, but the thing underneath, the part that was tired and furious, and underneath all of it, something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. "I had a life," she said, and her voice was level but not empty. "A small one, a quiet one, but it was mine." Lucien Moretti, who had made his name by never letting anything show in his face, looked at her with an expression that had something unguarded in it. "I know," he said for the 3rd time, "and I'm going to spend however long it takes making sure you can keep one." Celine looked at him for a long moment. Then she pushed back from the table and stood up, and she said, "You'd better start talking, because whoever they send first, they'll send by morning." She was right. She was always right about timing. It had kept her alive before, and it would need to do it again. Outside the building, the city moved through its morning, taxis, deliveries, the particular noise of a place that never completely sleeps. Somewhere across town, Damon Cross was holding a photograph of a woman he'd thought he knew, and beginning to understand that everything was more complicated and more dangerous than it had been 12 hours earlier. He just didn't know yet how much more dangerous. That understanding was coming, and it was bringing company. The first person they sent came before dawn. Celine heard the elevator before anyone else in the building did. A subtle wrongness in the mechanical sound, the way it paused 2 floors below and then continued. The kind of hesitation that means someone pressed the wrong button on purpose to check for cameras. She was already moving when Lucien's man at the door turned to tell her. "I know," she said. She crossed the room to the window and looked down at the street. One of the black SUVs from the night before was still at the curb. 2 of Lucien's men visible. She counted the angles, the alley entrance, the service door on the east wall. the parking structure adjacent. Then she found what she was looking for, a sedan parked 2 blocks north with its engine running, just sitting there, exhaust curling in the cold air, nobody getting out. "There's a second team," she said. "The elevator is a distraction." Lucien came up behind her and looked over her shoulder without touching her. "Service entrance? Probably. You need to move your men on the south wall." He was already on his phone before she finished the sentence. What followed was not a firefight. It didn't escalate that far. Not yet. 2 men in the stairwell, well-dressed, the kind of dressed that means armed and trying not to look it. Lucien's people intercepted them on the third-floor landing, and the conversation was brief. The men were removed from the building, and the sedan drove away 7 minutes later, professionally executed on both sides. The kind of encounter that doesn't make noise because everyone involved understands the noise would cost more than the exchange. When it was over, Celine sat in a chair by the window with her arms folded and her eyes on the street and said, "That was a probe. They weren't expecting to get through. They wanted to see how long it took you to respond and where your people were positioned." "Vega's people," Lucien said. It wasn't a question. "That'd be my assumption." She looked at him. "How much do you know about Marco Vega?" "Enough." "That's not an answer." He pulled a chair out from the table and sat down across from her, not behind the power position at the head of the table, just across from her like a person talking to another person. She noticed that about him. He'd always done that, chosen proximity over posture. "Enough to know his operation runs on information more than force," Lucien said. "He buys what he needs. Sources inside law enforcement, inside financial institutions, inside other organizations. He's been expanding for 3 years into territory that used to belong to the Hargrove family. And now he's expanding into yours. He's been trying." Celine looked at the table. "He was there that night," she said. "At the gala. Not personally. Someone watching for him. Someone who saw your face and put together who you came for." She exhaled. "I gave you 11 years and you burned my cover in 45 seconds. Lucien took that without deflecting. "Yes. I'm not asking for an apology. I'm telling you the math." She stood up and moved to the window again, a habit she'd never broken. Always the window, always checking movement. "Vega doesn't know what I know. He just knows I matter to you, which means I matter to him. That's a different kind of danger than what I was managing before." "What were you managing before?" She was quiet for a moment. The city outside was beginning to gray toward morning, that specific pre-dawn color that makes buildings look like they're made of smoke. "Staying small enough that old debts forgot me," she said. "It was working." "For how much longer?" She didn't answer that because they both knew she didn't have one. Across the city, Damon Cross had not slept. He'd moved from the couch to the kitchen table to the floor and back to the couch, which was not a strategy, but just the restlessness of a mind that can't settle. He had the photograph in front of him, the one Marcus had sent, Celine in front of the jet, 26 or 27, wearing clothes that cost real money, looking at something outside the frame. He'd been trying to locate what was wrong with his marriage by going backward through it, the way you try to find a leak by tracing the water stain. He kept arriving at the same thing. She had never asked him for anything, not money, not support, not validation. At the time he'd experienced this as compatibility, a woman who didn't need tending, who managed herself, who didn't make emotional demands on his schedule. He told a colleague once, in one of those casual male-to-male confessionals that happen at bars after enough drinks, that Celine was low maintenance. The word had come out of his mouth comfortably, like a compliment. He understood now what it actually meant. Low maintenance. He'd mistaken her deliberate self-containment, the practiced, careful art of a woman who'd had to survive on her own resources for a long time, for an absence of depth. He'd seen a flat surface and assumed there was nothing underneath. He hadn't looked because looking hadn't seemed necessary. He was a particular kind of fool. He was beginning to understand. Not stupid, not cruel exactly, just incurious about anyone who didn't immediately reflect something useful back at him. His phone rang at 6:40 a.m., number he didn't recognize. He answered anyway because at this point his threshold for strangeness had been permanently recalibrated. The voice was male, unhurried, spoke the way people speak when they want you to know they're not nervous. "Mr. Cross, You don't know me. My name isn't important. What's important is that we have an interest in common. Damon said, "Who is this?" "Someone who knows your wife better than you do, which, given last night, isn't saying much." A pause. "I'd like to have a conversation. A short one. Nothing that requires you to leave your apartment." "I'm not interested." "Mr. Cross?" The voice shifted. Still unhurried, but with something under it now, a weight that changed the temperature of the call. "You just publicly divorced the most valuable woman in the Eastern underworld. You don't have the option of not being interested. You're already involved. The question is whether you're involved intelligently or not." Damon's hand tightened on the phone. "What do you want?" "Just to talk. A car will be outside in 30 minutes. You don't have to come. But I'd strongly suggest thinking about what happens to men who know things about Celine Vale and don't have anyone's protection." The call ended. Damon sat with the dead phone in his hand. Then he did something that surprised even himself. He called Marcus Reed. Marcus picked up on the first ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. "I was about to call you," Marcus said. "Someone just contacted me. Offered to send a car." A pause. "Describe the call." Damon did. When he finished, Marcus was quiet long enough that Damon checked the connection. "Don't get in that car," Marcus said. "Why?" "Because the only people who knew to contact you that fast are people who had eyes on that ballroom last night, which means they're already pulling your thread. A car ride means a conversation in a space they control, and those conversations have a habit of ending in ways the person being driven doesn't anticipate." Another pause. "Damon, I need you to hear me. This stopped being a divorce 2 hours ago. I don't know what it is now, but it's not a divorce." "I know." "Do you have somewhere you can go? Not your office, not your gym, not anywhere that's in your regular pattern?" Damon thought about it. "My brother's place. He's in Connecticut. Go there. Don't use a car service with your account. Pay cash for a cab if you can. Don't bring your laptop." "Marcus, just go, Damon. I'll call you when I know more." A beat. "And for what it's worth, whatever you thought you knew about your wife, you were wrong. Not a little wrong. Significantly wrong. Don't make assumptions going forward about anything." The line went dead. Damon Cross packed a bag in 11 minutes and was out of the apartment before the car that never should have come arrived at his curb. The morning ground on. By 9 o'clock, word had moved through the layers of the city the way information always moves in those layers. Sideways, through intermediaries, in fragments that people assembled into pictures depending on what they already believed. The story wasn't one story. It was 4 or 5, each with different details, each serving the interests of whoever was telling it. The version that mattered most was the one circulating through Marco Vega's network, and that version was this. Lucien Moretti had publicly exposed himself to protect a woman, which meant the woman was either leverage or weakness, and either way, she was useful. Marco Vega ran his organization from the 43rd floor of a legitimate commercial building in a part of the city that didn't look like where organized crime operated, because Marco Vega understood that the greatest protection was resemblance to ordinary things. He had 3 legitimate businesses that employed 200 people and generated enough revenue that his tax returns were, genuinely, unremarkable. He'd learned this from watching older men go down for the very thing they were most proud of: visibility. He was 54 years old, built like a man who'd been athletic once and hadn't entirely given it up. With a head of gray hair he kept short and a habit of making eye contact slightly too long, just past the point of comfort. People found him unsettling without being able to say why. The why was simple. He was a man who decided a long time ago that other people were variables in calculations rather than ends in themselves, and this showed through in the face no matter how carefully a person trained their expressions. He stood at his window at 9:15 in the morning and listened to his associate, a careful man named Briggs, give him the summary of the previous 12 hours. "Moretti's woman," Vega said when Briggs finished. That's what the room understood. But the word from Harmon, he had someone at the gala. The word is she wasn't presenting like someone's woman. She was walking out when Moretti came in, on her own. Walking out from what? Her husband, public divorce, made a scene. Briggs paused. The husband is a corporate type, no connections to anything. He's already gone to ground somewhere outside the city. Vega turned from the window. The woman's name. Celine Vale, but it's a constructed identity. We've hit 3 walls in the last 4 hours. Vega looked at him. Same walls Moretti's been hitting for 11 years? Briggs's expression shifted slightly. Possibly. So he found her, and we still don't know who she is. Vega pulled his jacket off the back of his chair and shrugged it on. That's a problem that has a solution. The husband. He's in the wind. He won't stay there. Men like that don't know how to stay anywhere uncomfortable. Vega straightened his lapels. Find him. Don't approach yet. Just find him. And I want a full picture on the husband's relationship with the wife. How long, how close, what she might have told him. Briggs nodded. And Moretti? Leave Moretti alone for now. He's protecting her, which means he's predictable. Predictable is manageable. Vega sat down at his desk. What I want to know is why she's worth protecting. 11 years Moretti's been looking. Men like Moretti don't search that long for sentiment. There's something she has or something she knows, and I want to know what it is before he decides to use it. Briggs left. Vega opened his laptop and began reading, as he did every morning, the overnight intelligence summaries his people compiled. He was halfway through the 3rd document when he found a name that made him stop. He read the section twice. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling and said very quietly to no one, "There you are." Inside the building with no name, Celine was trying to sleep in a room with a cot and a window that faced a wall, and failing because she hadn't slept well in 11 years and she wasn't going to start now just because the circumstances had changed. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and thought about a night a long time ago when she'd made a decision in approximately 30 seconds that had determined the entire shape of everything that came after. She thought about it the way you think about a scar, not with regret exactly, more with the specific awareness that some things cut deep enough to stay. She'd been 27, working under a different name in a different city, doing the kind of work she didn't describe to people. Intelligence adjacent, not government exactly. More accurately, the space between government and private interest where certain people operated when official channels were too visible or too slow. She'd been good at it, not because she was violent, she wasn't, not by preference, but because she was patient and precise and could read a room's emotional architecture the way some people read text. The night in question, she'd been extraction support on an operation she'd been told was a simple retrieval. It wasn't. It was a setup, and the person being set up was Lucien Moretti, who was 39 at the time and whose organization was in the middle of a succession war that 3 different parties were actively trying to accelerate by removing him. She'd figured it out 40 minutes before the trap was scheduled to close. She'd had 2 options: walk away, maintain her cover, preserve her continued usefulness to the people who'd hired her, or warn him. The people who'd hired her had, she'd realized in those 40 minutes, also been complicit in what happened to her family 6 years earlier. They weren't the architects. She still didn't know who the architects were, but they were adjacent to it. They'd known and said nothing and benefited from the silence. She'd warned Lucien, pulled him out of the building through a service corridor with 11 minutes to spare and put him in a car headed north and then walked in the opposite direction and kept walking. She hadn't told him her name. She'd been wearing a face obscured by shadow and a collar pulled high. By the time he'd understood what had happened, she was already on a bus under her 3rd alias in as many years. She'd started building Celine Vale 2 months later. She'd built her carefully, brick by brick. The paralegal credentials, the work history, the social media absence that read as disinterest rather than deliberate erasure. She'd chosen Damon partly because he was uncurious, and partly because his particular kind of ambitious, self-focused energy made him easy to stay near without being truly seen. She was not proud of this. It was cold, and it was using him. She'd told herself it was manageable, that she wasn't hurting him, that she was just using proximity to stability as cover. She'd told herself this long enough that some days she almost believed it. She hadn't expected to feel anything real. That had been the thing she hadn't planned for. She rolled onto her side and stared at the wall. By 10 in the morning, Lucien's intelligence network had confirmed what Celine predicted. At least 2 organizations were actively trying to identify her. Vega's was the largest concern, but there was a second signature in the inquiry pattern that Lucien's people recognized without being able to name. Older method, more careful, the fingerprints of someone who'd been doing this before most of his current operators were born. Lucien brought this to Celine with a tablet showing the data, and she looked at it for a long time without speaking. "You know who this is," he said. "I have a guess." She set the tablet down. "There's a man. I never knew his name. I knew him by a method, by how he moved. He was the person who contracted the operation the night I pulled you out." She looked up at Lucien. "He's the person I've been hiding from for 11 years, not from you." The room was quiet for a moment. "You should have told me," Lucien said. "You should have left me alone," she said, and her voice was even, but the words had edge. "We both made decisions. If I'd known..." "You'd have done what? Declared war 11 years ago? Pulled me out of a life I was building and put me in a safe house?" She shook her head. "I was safe because I was invisible. That was the entire strategy. That strategy ended last night." "I know." She said it quietly, just 2 words and a lot of weight behind them. One of Lucien's men knocked and entered with a phone. "We found the husband," he said. Celine and Lucien both looked at him. "He went to his brother's place in Connecticut, but he didn't go alone. Someone followed him from the city. We have footage from a toll booth camera. The tail car is registered to a shell company that traces back to a Vega subsidiary." Celine stood up. Her voice was flat and precise. "They'll move on him." "He doesn't know anything," Lucien said. "It doesn't matter what he knows. What matters is what Vega thinks he might know." She was already moving toward the door. "Damon is leverage. They're going to take him." Lucien was on his feet. "My people can get there faster. Your people will spook the surveillance team and they'll accelerate the timeline." She turned at the door. "I need a car and 2 people who know how to move without being seen. That's all." Lucien looked at her, the particular look of a man who is calculating whether to argue and concluding that the argument is already lost. "Carver and Ness," he said to the man with the phone, "get them on the road in 5 minutes." Celine was already in the corridor. The drive to Connecticut took just under 2 hours, Carver behind the wheel and Ness in the passenger seat, and Celine in the back with her eyes closed but not sleeping. The specific stillness of someone conserving energy rather than resting. They didn't talk. Carver and Ness had the easy silence of people who'd worked together long enough to communicate in shorthand. Somewhere on the highway, Celine's phone buzzed. Text from a number she didn't recognize, but the phrasing was structured in a way that made her sit up. A specific pattern she'd used herself once, a way of sending messages that verified the sender without names. She read it twice. Then she looked out the window at the gray highway landscape and said nothing for the rest of the drive. Damon Cross's brother had a house on 2 acres outside a small town whose main quality was that it was far from anything he'd done. His name was Carter Cross, 7 years older than Damon, a man who'd made peace a long time ago with his brother's particular brand of ambition by simply not engaging with it. He'd received Damon at 7 in the morning with a cup of coffee and no questions, which was the thing about Carter that Damon had never fully appreciated. By midday, Damon had given Carter enough of the story that Carter was sitting very still across the kitchen table with both hands around his mug. "A Mafia Boss knelt in front of her," Carter said, "in front of 140 people. And you didn't know." "I didn't know." Damon said it without defense, just the plain fact of it. I thought she was someone who didn't have anything going on outside our life." Carter looked at him. Carter had the kind of face that had aged into its expressions, lines around the eyes that came from squinting at things honestly rather than from sun. "You thought she was simple," he said. "That's what you mean." Damon didn't argue. "What kind of man," Carter said slowly, "publicly asks for a divorce in a room full of people?" "Carter, I'm asking. Not for her sake. For yours. What kind of man does that?" Damon sat with the question. It was more uncomfortable than anything else that had happened in the last 18 hours, and that was saying something. He was still sitting with it when the car came down Carter's long gravel driveway. Not Celine's car. The wrong car. A black sedan that came in fast and parked sideways across the drive. and two men got out who moved the way men move when they've been told to move quickly. Carter stood up. "What is unforgettable?" Damon said. "Carter, get inside the house right now." He didn't entirely know why he said it with such certainty. Some part of him had been primed by the early morning phone call, by Marcus's warning, by the accumulated strangeness of the previous 12 hours resolving into a single shape. Carter went inside. Damon stood on the porch. The two men from the sedan stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. The one in front was broad through the shoulders, face professionally blank. "Mr. Cross, we'd like you to come with us." "I don't know who you are," Damon said. "Someone who has questions about your wife." The man's voice was level. "The same questions you have. It would benefit you to help us find the answers." "And if I don't come?" The man looked at him, just looked. The second man had moved slightly to the right, which Damon registered without fully processing what it meant. "Mr. Cross, this isn't really a choice we're offering." From somewhere behind the house, a sound, not loud, more like pressure. The specific displacement of air that Damon had no reference point to name. The two men from the sedan both turned. Carver and Ness came around the east side of the house. They moved with a quality that Damon would later struggle to describe. Not threatening exactly, not aggressive, just final. The quality of people for whom this is not an unfamiliar situation. From the tree line at the edge of Carter's property, a third figure emerged. She was wearing dark clothes, her hair pulled back, and she walked across the dead grass with the same composed, unhurried movement she'd had in the ballroom the night before, except that now, without the dress and the champagne glass, the composure had a different quality to it. Damon Cross looked at his wife and understood, in approximately 4 seconds, that he had never known who she was. The man from the sedan looked at Celine. Something shifted in his professional blankness. Not fear, more the recalibration of someone who has just realized the variables are different from what was briefed. Celine stopped 8 feet away from him. Her eyes went to his hands, to his partner's position, to the sedan, and back to his face. This all happened in approximately 2 seconds. "Tell Vega she's not here," she said. "And tell him the next time he sends someone after the people I used to know, I stop being quiet about what I know about Tiverton." The man's jaw tightened. "I don't know what—" "You don't need to know what it means. He will." She held the man's gaze. "Go." They went. The sedan backed down the driveway and turned onto the road and disappeared. Carver and Ness held their positions until the engine sound was gone, then relaxed by degrees. Damon stood on the porch and looked at Celine across the dead winter grass. "Tiverton," he said. She looked up at him. "Don't." "What is Tiverton?" For a moment, she just looked at him. The composure in her face was absolute, the way composure is when it's been built over many years out of necessity. Then something underneath it moved, briefly. Not weakness, more like the acknowledgement of weight. "It's the reason," she said, "that I'm out of time." She said it quietly, almost to herself, and the words landed the way words land when they're not for the listener's benefit, but just the truth finally spoken into air. Behind her, Carver's phone buzzed. He answered, listened for 5 seconds, and looked at Celine with an expression that changed the temperature of the entire yard. "It's Lucien," he said. "They found the man who's been running the second set of inquiries." A pause. "He's not Vega's." Celine went very still. "He's the same man who contracted the operation 11 years ago." Carver's voice was careful, the voice of someone delivering bad news to a person they respect. "And he's already in the city. He arrived this morning, Lucien says." Another pause. "Lucien says he's not looking for information anymore. He's moved to the next phase." The yard was very quiet. Damon Cross stood on the porch of his brother's house and watched something happen to Celine's face. Not fear, not panic, but the specific expression of a person who has been running a careful calculation for 11 years and has just heard that one of the foundational numbers was wrong. She turned and looked at Carver. "Get the car." "Celine," Damon started. She looked at him. The look was not unkind. It was the look of a woman who has spent years managing damage and who is now, whether she chose it or not, out of runway. "Go back inside with your brother," she said. Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone who doesn't call Carter's landline first and say the word November. She held his eyes. Can you remember that? November, Damon said. Good. She turned toward the car. Celine. His voice came out rougher than he intended. She stopped but didn't turn. I'm sorry, he said, for last night. It doesn't cover it. I know it doesn't cover it, but I need you to know I said it. She stood still for a moment. Then she said, without turning around, I know you did. She got in the car. Carver pulled down the drive and turned onto the road, and the sound of the engine faded, and Damon Cross stood on the porch in the cold with the word November in his head, and the dawning, bone-deep understanding that the woman he'd just watched drive away had been carrying a war on her back for longer than they'd been married, and now the war had found its address. The car was 40 minutes out of Connecticut when Lucien called again. Celine had the phone to her ear before the second ring. Carver kept his eyes on the road. Ness had turned in the passenger seat and was watching the mirrors. Talk, she said. Lucien's voice was different from the morning, compressed, the way his voice got when he was moving and talking simultaneously. His name is Edmund Hale, former intelligence contractor, went private in 2004. The people who hired him 11 years ago were a consortium, not a cartel, not a single organization, a financing group that sits behind 3 different criminal networks and funds them like a portfolio. I know what it is, Celine said. His file has a photograph. Celine. A pause. He was at the gala. She didn't say anything. Not as a guest. He was in the building earlier that day for a contracted security walkthrough. Hartley Enterprises used his consulting firm for venue security assessments. Another pause. He was in that building 6 hours before Damon said what he said. He saw you. The road outside the window moved under the car. Celine watched the white lines pass without counting them. So the gala wasn't coincidence, she said. I don't think so anymore. You think Damon? I don't know what I think yet. His voice was careful. I'm not accusing. I'm telling you the shape of what we have, and the shape suggests that someone knew you'd be in that building. Whether that knowledge came from Damon, or from surveillance on Damon, or from something else entirely, I don't know. Celine closed her eyes for 3 seconds, opened them. Where is Hale now? We lost him an hour ago. He moved on foot from his hotel, switched twice, went into a parking structure, and didn't come out the ground level. He's somewhere in the city. He's not coming after me directly, she said. That's not how he works. He builds pressure from the outside. He'll go after someone adjacent, someone he can use to force movement. She thought about it. Lucien, your organization has a man named Reyes, your financial coordinator for the Eastern accounts. What about him? Has anyone checked on Reyes in the last 6 hours? A silence that was slightly too long. Lucien. I'm checking. She heard him moving, heard a door, heard him speaking to someone in a low voice. Then he came back and said, Reyes called in sick this morning. Nobody's been able to reach him since. The car hit a rough patch of road. Celine braced against the door with her elbow. He has Reyes, she said. Hale has your financial coordinator, and he is going to pull everything he needs to know about your accounts, your structure, your people. Not to use it himself. He'll sell it. To Vega, or to whoever in the portfolio consortium is paying him for this particular job. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth briefly, a single, contained gesture. How much does Reyes know? Too much, Lucien said, and he said it quietly. How long before it matters? If they move the information fast, 48 hours, maybe less, then we have a problem with a fixed deadline. She looked at the passing road. I need to know everything you have on Hale's methods. Safe houses he's used in the city, contractors he's worked with, any pattern in how he holds people. I'll have it sent to your phone. And Lucien, she stopped. Yeah. The gala, the 6 hours. I need to know if Damon's phone or email had any contact with Hale or with anyone connected to Hale's consulting firm in the last 3 months. I need to know before I decide what to believe. Another careful pause. I'll get someone on it. She ended the call and sat with the phone in her lap and looked at the road. Carver said nothing. He was the kind of man who understood that some information needed to sit for a minute before it could be responded to usefully. After about 2 miles, Celine said, "When we get back, I need 30 minutes alone before we go to Lucien's building. There's something I need to check." Carver nodded. Ness turned back to the mirror and said nothing. The 30 minutes took her to a storage unit in a facility in the northwest of the city that she'd rented under a name that didn't connect to Celine Vale or to anything preceding it. The name on the rental agreement was the same name she'd used for the bus ticket 11 years ago, her last act of the old self before the new one took over. She'd kept the unit as what she privately called an argument, proof that the past was still there, still real, that she hadn't entirely invented herself. Inside the unit were 4 things: a fireproof lockbox, a duffel bag, a laptop in a hard case, and a photograph taped to the inside of the door. She looked at the photograph first. It was her parents, not the posed kind, a candid, the two of them at a kitchen table with coffee cups and a newspaper, not looking at the camera, her mother laughing at something off-frame. The quality was slightly soft the way photographs were before digital sharpness became the standard. Her father's hand was on the table, 2 fingers touching her mother's wrist. The smallest possible gesture of contact. She looked at it for 4 seconds. That was her rule. 4 seconds, no more, or it became something she'd carry into whatever she was about to do. She opened the lockbox. Inside was a drive and a folder of documents and a handgun she checked with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd done it so many times the process had left conscious thought behind. She put the gun in the back of her waistband, took the drive, left the documents. The laptop took 90 seconds to boot. She plugged in the drive and navigated to a folder she hadn't opened in 4 years and pulled up a file that was titled, with the flat utility of someone who didn't want to think about the name, simply Tiverton. Tiverton was a shipping port. Or it had been, technically it still was, operating under a name that had changed twice in the intervening years, the kind of corporate rebaptism that exists specifically to make continuity difficult to trace. 11 years ago, a significant amount of money had moved through Tiverton's accounts. Not drug money, not weapons, something more mundane and more damaging. The financial infrastructure for a systematic fraud that had collapsed several pension funds in 3 states and left thousands of people with retirement accounts that were worth approximately nothing. Celine had found this because she'd been looking for something else. She'd been pulling the financial thread that connected the people who contracted the operation against Lucien to the people who had, 6 years before that, been connected to her parents' deaths. And in the middle of that thread, she'd found Tiverton. And inside Tiverton, she'd found Edmund Hale's name in a role that was described as external advisory, but that the actual documents made clear was something much more structural and much more culpable. She'd held this information for 11 years. It was the only leverage she had against a man who had, as far as she could determine, no other exploitable weakness. Hale had no family he was close to, no public profile, no financial holdings that couldn't be dissolved and moved in 48 hours. The only thing that could genuinely damage him was documentation that put him in a prison cell. She'd kept it as a deterrent, the same way countries kept certain weapons, not to use, but so the other side knew the cost of escalation. She transferred the relevant files to a second drive, shut the laptop, and was back in the car in under 25 minutes. Carver drove without asking. Ness rode silent. At Lucien's building, she found him in the main room with 3 of his people around a table covered in printed sheets and a screen showing a city map with marked locations. He looked up when she came in and read something in her face that he didn't name. "Reyes," she said. "Still nothing. I need everything you have on Hale's past safe houses in this city. Not guesses, confirmed locations. Places your people can physically verify." One of the men at the table, she'd met him briefly the night before, a quiet man named Garrett who ran logistics, slid a sheet toward her. 7 addresses, 3 of them checked and annotated. She looked at the annotations. Her eye stopped at the 4th address on the list, which was not checked. "What's the status on this one?" "We haven't been able to confirm," Garrett said. "It's a commercial property, light manufacturing on the first 2 floors, storage above that. We got an anonymous tip that it was associated with Hale's network, but we haven't put eyes on it." "When did the tip come in?" 2 hours ago." Celine looked at Lucien. Lucien said, "I know. An anonymous tip 2 hours after Hale goes dark," she said. "That's either a genuine source or a setup." Either way, if Reyes is there, if it's a setup and we walk into it, we lose people, and Hale has exactly what he wanted. She put the sheet down. I need to go alone first, reconnaissance only. If Reyes is there and I can confirm it, then we move with the team. No, Lucien said. Not aggressive, just a wall. Lucien, you're not going alone. I'm harder to detect alone. 2 people is the minimum for noise, and Hale's people will be watching the approach. She met his eyes. This is what I do. This is what I've always done. Trust the skill or don't, but don't argue with the logic. He looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that has calculation and something else in it, something that doesn't have a clean name. Take Ness, he said. She's the smallest footprint I have. Celine looked at Ness, who was leaning against the wall with her arms folded. Ness raised one eyebrow in a way that meant she had no objection to any of this. Fine, Celine said. They went at dusk, when the light does the useful thing of being neither day nor night, when cameras catch shapes without faces and people on the street stop looking up. The commercial building was in a part of the city that had been redeveloping for 6 years without quite tipping into redeveloped. Scaffolding on facades, new glass fronts on old brick bones, the uncomfortable in-between state of a neighborhood that couldn't decide what it was becoming. Ness was, as advertised, a small footprint. She moved in that particular urban way of someone who'd learned to be unremarkable. Hands in her jacket, pace matching the pedestrian traffic, eyes forward. Celine moved beside her the same way, and they were just 2 women walking in a city at dusk, nothing to see. They circled the block once. On the second pass, Celine counted 3 things. A man near the building's east entrance who was dressed like a smoker but hadn't taken a drag in 6 minutes. A car idling in the loading zone with fogged windows that suggested occupants who'd been sitting there long enough to breathe up the glass, and a camera on the northwest corner that was angled too low to be surveilling the building and too high to be watching the entrance, positioned, specifically, to watch the approach from the direction of Lucien's building. They were expected. Celine touched Ness's elbow. They kept walking, didn't slow, turned the corner, and went down a block before she spoke. It's a trap, she said. Hale's not inside. Ness's voice was level. Then where's Reyes? I don't know yet. She stood at the corner and looked down the street. The evening moved around her. People heading home, a delivery truck, the smell of fried food from somewhere. Normal city. The tip was designed to pull us here, which means Hale's doing something else while we're looking at this building. Her phone buzzed. Lucien. She answered, and he spoke before she could. Celine, we have a problem. Something in his voice was different. She went still against the wall. Damon called the number Carter's landline was supposed to use, Lucien said. He used the word November. But it wasn't Damon who called. Someone is using his phone. Her jaw tightened. When? 20 minutes ago. I've been trying to reach Carter's landline since then. No answer. 20 minutes ago, she'd been circling a building on the other side of the city. They took him, she said. Not a question. It looks that way. She looked at Ness. Ness read her face and straightened away from the wall without being told. The building was a diversion, Celine said. Hale sent us across the city to watch a trap so his people could move on Damon without us in range. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for exactly 1 second. Lucien, Hale knows the protocol. He knows the word November. How? A silence. Lucien, how does Edmund Hale know a protocol that only you and I and Carter Cross and Damon Cross could know? The silence stretched 1 beat too long. I need you to answer me, she said, and her voice had dropped to something cold and precise. The protocol was relayed through 3 people on my end, Lucien said slowly. Garrett set up the communication infrastructure when we established the safe house arrangements this morning. He built the relay that transmitted it to Carter's landline. Is Garrett there right now? A pause. She heard movement. Garrett left 40 minutes ago, Lucien said. He said he was going to verify the manufacturing building location in person. The whole shape of it landed at once. Garrett had built the relay. Garrett had received the anonymous tip about the manufacturing building. Garrett had left 40 minutes ago. 20 minutes before someone used Damon's phone to test the protocol word they should not have known. She said, "Garrett is Hales." The words came out flat and certain. Lucienne said nothing, which was its own answer. She leaned against the wall of the building behind her and looked at the street and felt the specific terrible sensation of a plan she hadn't made, had never had the chance to make, collapsing around a betrayal she hadn't seen coming because she hadn't been watching from close enough. 11 years ago, she'd walked away specifically to avoid becoming entangled in exactly this kind of web. She'd known it then. The closer you stood to power, the more threads you accumulated that you couldn't see clearly, the more vectors there were for someone to reach you through someone you trusted. She'd stayed outside. She'd stayed small. And she'd ended up here anyway. Get everyone you can trust, not people who trusted Garrett, people you personally trust, and find out where Hale operates when he's not where we expect him, she said. I need a list of every location that Garrett had access to, every communication he relayed, every piece of infrastructure he touched this morning. That's most of the operation since last night, Lucian said quietly. I know. She pushed off the wall. Which means we don't know what's been compromised and what hasn't, and we have to act on the assumption that it's everything. Celine, find Damon, she said. Whatever Hale wants with him, it's not information. Damon doesn't know enough to be worth holding for information. He's holding Damon because Damon is the one person who can reliably draw me out of position. She ended the call. Ness was watching her. Not with sympathy, exactly. With the clear-eyed readiness of someone waiting for a direction. We need a car, Celine said. Not one of Lucian's. Ness pulled keys from her jacket pocket. Street parking on the next block. Registered to nothing connected to either of us. I keep it here. A beat. I've been doing this a long time. Celine looked at her. How long? Long enough to know that when the infrastructure gets burned, you go back to what you had before the infrastructure. Ness started walking. What did you have 11 years ago? A bus ticket and a bad feeling, Celine said, and followed her. They found the car and were moving within 4 minutes. Celine navigated from memory, not toward any of the locations on Garrett's list, not toward any address that had passed through the morning's communication channels. She navigated towards something older and simpler, the way Edmund Hale had operated before he'd had resources, before he'd had infrastructure, when he'd been running operations in this city on lean budgets and doing what lean budget operators always do when they need to hold someone without spending money on visible facilities. She directed Ness to a part of the waterfront that had been given over to light industrial and marine supply, the kind of area that generated enough legitimate traffic of large vehicles and late hours that unusual activity blended without effort. Piers and warehouses and the permanent background smell of diesel and salt water. It was the kind of place Edmund Hale would have used once and dismissed as too obvious, and then returned to precisely because the dismissal made it feel safe. Drive past, she said when they were 2 blocks out. Don't slow. They drove past. She counted loading doors, vehicle positions, light sources, the specific darkness pattern of a building with no interior lights versus a building with lights that were being blocked. Third structure from the end, she said. Southeast corner. There's light around the door seal. Ness said, You want to call Lucienne. Celine thought about Garrett, about the relay he'd built, about every piece of information that had moved through Lucienne's network since the previous night. Not yet, she said. I don't know which channels are clean. Ness pulled the car around the block and parked in the shadow of a loading structure, killed the lights. The engine went quiet and the waterfront sounds filled the space. Water, cables, something mechanical and distant. They sat for a moment. There'll be at least 3 people inside, Celine said. Possibly more. Hale doesn't run small when he has something valuable. She checked the gun. I need Damon alive, and I need whatever Reyes told them before I arrived. And Hale. Celine looked at the dark shape of the 3rd warehouse. The light around the door seal was faint, barely visible unless you knew what you were looking for. Hale, I need to have a conversation with, she said. What happens after that conversation depends on the conversation. She got out of the car. The waterfront was cold. The kind of cold that comes off open water and goes through fabric instead of around it. She moved along the base of the adjacent structure, staying in the deeper shadow, her footsteps careful on the concrete. Ness was 10 feet behind her and to the right, mirroring the pace without instruction. At the corner of the third warehouse, Celine stopped and listened for 30 seconds. Heard voices. One, muffled, male, the specific cadence of someone being asked questions and running out of ways to not answer. Heard a second voice, quieter, which she placed near the main door on the interior. She moved to the side entrance. Ness covered the corner. The side door was locked with a padlock that was new and expensive, which told her this was not a regular facility for Hale. This was improvised, assembled fast, using whatever was available, which meant the people inside were also improvised, not Hale's primary team, his secondaries. She went in through a window 6 feet along the wall that had been improperly latched. The kind of improperly latched that happens when someone closes it from outside in a hurry without checking. She'd been counting on finding exactly this kind of detail. Improvised operations always had them. Speed bred sloppiness. Inside, the warehouse was partitioned by old shelving units that divided the space into rough sections. The light came from 2 portable work lamps set up in the middle section. She could see shadows moving against the shelving. She moved along the wall and came around the partition edge and saw Damon Cross zip-tied to a metal chair, a cut on his forehead that had bled and dried, his jacket gone, shirt collar torn. Conscious. Looking at the 2 men in front of him with an expression that was resolving, she noticed, from fear, into something more stubborn. 1 man standing, 1 seated, a tablet on a folding table between them. Standard 2-person hold operation. Manageable. She moved. The standing man heard something. She'd made a sound, deliberate, a scuff of her heel, because taking both of them simultaneously required one of them to turn. He turned. She covered the 3 steps between them fast enough that he was still registering the movement when the heel of her hand connected with his jaw. He went down hard and sideways. The seated man was fast. She gave him that. He was fast. He cleared the chair without fumbling. But he had the table in his way, and that bought her the half-second she needed to be inside his reach before he could create distance. The gun he went for clattered against the concrete. It was over in 11 seconds. Damon was staring at her. His face had gone through approximately 4 expressions in the time it took her to cross the warehouse, and she could see him trying to put them in order. "November," he said. It came out strange. Not the word, but the sound of a man who is using a code word to anchor himself to reality. "November," she said. She crouched and used the fallen man's knife to cut the zip tie at his wrists. His hands were red where the plastic had been. He flexed his fingers once, twice. "Are you hurt?" she said. "My head. They hit me when... in the car." He was looking at the 2 men on the floor. "Did you just... They're breathing." She stood. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then walk." She was moving toward the exit when she heard the 3rd voice. Not from behind her, from above, from the metal stairs in the far corner, a level up. She stopped. She'd miscounted, or she'd been expected to undercount. "That was very clean." Edmund Hale's voice came from the darkness above the stairs. "It always was. I remember that about you." Damon stopped behind her. Hale came down the stairs without hurrying. He was older than she remembered. She'd only seen him once, briefly, the night she'd pulled Lucienne out. A face in a doorway that she'd filed and carried ever since. Late 60s, thin in the way people get when metabolism outlasts appetite, gray hair worn short and flat. He wore a dark jacket and carried nothing visible. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at her with the specific familiarity of a man who has been thinking about someone for a long time. "Celine," he said. Just that. Her name, in his mouth, like he'd said it privately 1,000 times. "Edmund," she said. "I wasn't sure when you went to the other building, whether you'd come here or run." He glanced briefly at Damon. "But you came here because of him." Back to her. "That surprised me." "Let's not do the part where you explain your analysis," she said. "What do you want?" "The Tiverton files." No pause, no preamble. "I know you have them. I've known for 7 years. I've been leaving you alone because as long as you stayed quiet, mutually assured destruction was a functional arrangement." His eyes were calm. But you're not quiet anymore. Moretti found you. Vega knows you exist. The arrangement stopped being functional the moment those ballroom doors opened. So you want the files so you can eliminate the exposure. I want the files, and I want your word that what you know stays buried. He tilted his head slightly. In exchange, I walk away from this city, and you never see me again. Celine looked at him. The two work lamps threw light from a low angle and made shadows on his face that made him look older than he was. And Reyes, she said, released, already. He's in a cab 2 miles from here. And Garrett. Something moved in Hale's expression. Garrett is mine. He stays mine. No deal. Then we have a problem. We already had a problem, she said. We had it 11 years ago when you contracted an operation against a man to cover what you'd done at Tiverton, and I got close enough to understand what that meant. She watched his face. You killed people, Edmund. Not with your hands. You killed them the way careful men kill, through paperwork and fund transfers and redirected investigations. Pensioners. Working people who did everything right and ended up with nothing because you needed a mechanism, and they happened to be one. Hale's jaw moved once. The files, he said. Tell me one thing first, she said. My parents, before Tiverton, the people who were connected to what happened to them. She held his eyes. Were you involved? The silence in the warehouse was very complete. Hale looked at her, and in his face was the answer she'd been afraid of for 11 years. Not guilt, nothing as human as guilt, but the slight recalibration of a man who is deciding how much the truth costs him in this particular moment. That was a separate matter, he said. That's not a no, she said. No, he said carefully. It is not a no. The word went through her slowly. Not like a shock. More like the confirmation of something she'd suspected long enough that hearing it said aloud felt less like revelation and more like a door closing. The last version of events where she'd been wrong about this particular thing was gone. She breathed. In, out. Her hands were still. Damon behind her said nothing. She felt him not saying anything, felt the held breath of a man who understands he is standing inside something much larger than he'd imagined. The files, Hale said again. His voice was level, but there was something under it now. The level voice of a man who is choosing patience because he is not yet certain how the room will move. Celine reached into her jacket. She pulled out the drive. Hale's eyes went to it. She said, There are 3 copies. This one that will transmit automatically to a federal prosecutor's office in 48 hours if I don't cancel it, and one with someone you'll never find. She held the drive at her side. So even if this conversation ends badly for me, the information ends well for everyone else. Hale looked at the drive. Then at her, then at the drive again. You built that in 11 years, he said, while living as a paralegal. I built that in the first 6 months, she said. I spent the other 10.5 years hoping I wouldn't need it. A long silence. Then Hale said, What do you want? And Celine said, Garrett, every piece of your network's access to Lucian's organization, a full accounting, in writing, signed, detailed, of every person involved in what happened to my parents. She let a beat pass. And then you disappear, not from the city, from everything. You retire so completely that your name stops appearing anywhere that matters. Hale was quiet for a moment, the longest moment in the room so far. And if I agree, he said, you hold the files forever. I hold the files as long as the agreement holds. She looked at him. Break it. And the 48-hour transmission goes out that day. He looked at her for a very long time, the kind of looking that is actually calculation, running variables, testing outcomes. Then he said, I'll need 24 hours to compile the accounting. You have 12. Something moved in his face that might, on a different man, have been respect. 12, he said. Celine looked at him for one more second. Then she turned to Damon. Can you walk fast? Yes, Damon said. He'd been standing very still. Then we're leaving, she said. She moved toward the door and Damon moved with her, and she did not look back at Edmund Hale standing at the bottom of the stairs in the warehouse light. She didn't need to look back. She'd looked at that man long enough. Outside, the waterfront air hit cold and real, and she kept moving, Damon beside her, his stride unsteady at first, and then finding its pace, and the dark water of the harbor was visible between the buildings as they walked, and the lights of the city made a glow above the rooflines, and everything felt both very resolved and very precarious at exactly the same time. Ness fell in on Celine's other side from the shadow of the building without a word, and the three of them walked to the car. Inside, before Ness started the engine, Damon said, "He was involved. In your parents." "Yes," Celine said. "And you just—" He stopped, started again. "You made a deal with him." She looked at the windshield. "I made a deal that keeps him controllable, keeps his information accessible, and doesn't require a war to enforce." She was quiet for a moment. The alternative was a confrontation in a warehouse that he'd stacked in his favor, which is what he wanted. Damon sat with that. "You wanted to kill him." She turned and looked at him. The cut on his forehead had dried brown. His eyes were clearer than she'd expected. Not shock, not collapse, just a man who was looking at something he didn't know how to hold, and was choosing to hold it anyway. "Yes," she said. "But you didn't." "No." She turned back to the windshield. "Not yet." Ness started the engine. The car pulled out of the shadow of the loading structure, and the waterfront slipped behind them, and the city opened up in the headlights, and they drove toward the part of it where Lucien was waiting with his burned infrastructure and his compromised network, and his very limited list of people he could still trust. Celine pressed her back against the seat and looked at the city coming toward her through the glass, and thought about a photograph on the inside of a storage unit door. Two people at a kitchen table, coffee cups, a newspaper, a hand touching a wrist, and thought about the 12 hours she'd just given Edmund Hale, and thought about how 12 hours was either enough time or it wasn't, and how she would know the difference by what he did with them. The car made a turn and the harbor disappeared and the city closed around them like a hand. They got back to Lucien's building at 11:47 at night, and the first thing Celine noticed was that the front position was down to one man instead of three. She said, "Stop the car." Ness stopped. Celine looked at the building entrance for 15 seconds. One man, lights on in the upper floors. The SUV that had been at the curb since the previous night was gone. "Something happened," she said. Ness's hand was already at her jacket. "How do you want to do this?" "Drive past, go around the block, and come in from the service alley on the north side." Celine turned to Damon. "Stay in the car. Whatever you hear, stay in the car until Ness or I come back for you." Damon looked at her. The dried blood on his forehead had cracked at the edge when he'd been talking. "I'm not going to be useful sitting in a car. You're not going to be useful getting shot, either." She held his eyes. "Stay." He didn't argue. She filed that away. Ness drove the block and came into the service alley from the north. The alley ran between the building's back wall and a parking structure, poorly lit, the kind of space that exists in cities specifically because nobody wanted to look at it. She stopped 60 feet from the building's service entrance. The service door was open. Not kicked, open. Someone had unlocked it and left it ajar, which was either careless or deliberate, and careless was unlikely. Celine got out of the car. She moved along the alley wall with her back against the brick, the gun held low at her right side. Ness came up on the opposite wall, mirroring. 10 feet from the door, Celine stopped and listened. Voices inside. Multiple. The specific acoustics of a large interior space, voices bouncing off hard floors and walls. She identified 3 distinct ones, 2 agitated, 1 very calm. The calm one was Lucien. She went in. The service corridor opened into the building's back operations area. Electrical panels, storage, the mechanical room. Through a door at the far end, light and sound. She moved through and pushed the door open with her shoulder and came into the main room. Lucien was standing in the center of the room. Across from him were 2 men she didn't recognize, and beside them was Garrett, not restrained, not controlled, just standing there with the specific stillness of a man who has made a bet and is waiting to see if it pays. 3 of Lucien's remaining people were positioned around the room's edges. The tension in the space was the kind that had been building for a while and had stopped just short of breaking. Lucien looked at her when she came through the door. Something in his face changed. Not relief exactly, something more controlled than that. the recalibration of a man who has been holding a position and has just received reinforcement. Celine, he said, just her name. A lot in it. Garrett turned and looked at her. His expression did something complicated. Surprise, recalculation, and then a kind of settling into something harder. You made it back, he said. Disappointed? She said. Surprised. The warehouse was supposed to keep you occupied longer. The window latch was bad, she said. She looked at the two men with him. Neither of them she knew. Both of them were watching her with the professional attention of people assessing a variable they hadn't anticipated. She looked back at Garrett. Hale send you back here. I came back on my own, Garrett said, to finish the inventory of what Lucian's network knows. Hale needs a complete picture before the 12 hours are up. Celine went still. How do you know about 12 hours? Garrett looked at her. Then he looked at Lucian. Then he smiled, which was the wrong expression for the room, and he knew it and did it anyway. Because Edmund Hale had the warehouse wired, he said. Every word you said to him, every word he said to you, he heard it all. A beat. Including the part about the Tiverton files. The room recalibrated in real time. Lucian's eyes went to Celine. She understood the shape of it in the 3 seconds it took Garrett to finish smiling. Hale hadn't agreed to her terms because the terms were reasonable. He'd agreed because he needed 12 hours and she'd handed them to him by walking out of that warehouse thinking she'd won. The deal she'd made was a delay tactic. He'd used the 12 hours to find the third copy of the Tiverton files, the one she'd told him was with someone he'd never locate, and neutralize the transmission she'd set up before the 48 hours were out. She'd told him too much. She'd been so focused on the accounting, on the confession, on her parents' names in his mouth, that she'd given him the exact shape of her leverage so he could dismantle it. Where's the third copy? Garrett said. Gone, she said. Already moved. Celine. His voice was patient, the voice of someone who's been briefed on what to say. Hale doesn't want a war. He wants the files, and he wants the transmission canceled, and then he's done. You walk away. Moretti walks away. Even your ex-husband walks away. He paused. But if he has to take this apart piece by piece, he will, and it'll be significantly worse for everyone. He wired the warehouse, Lucian said. Not to anyone in particular, just saying it, the way a man processes information that changes his assessment. He wired the warehouse, Celine agreed, which means the 12-hour window was never a concession. No. He's already moving. Yes. Lucian looked at the two men Garrett had brought. Then he looked at his own people at the room's edges. Then he said to his people, in a voice that was very quiet and very clear, "Get them out." What happened in the next 45 seconds was not elegant. It was the kind of controlled violence that has a specific sound. The impact of bodies, the scrape of furniture, the particular grunt of a man who is being efficiently removed from a space he doesn't want to leave. Garrett's two men resisted. One of them made it almost to the door before Ness, who had come in behind Celine, did something fast and precise with her elbow that ended the attempt. Garrett himself didn't fight. He stood in the middle of the room while it happened around him and looked at Celine with an expression that was recalibrating again, the expression of a man who had expected the variables to add up differently. When it was done, when the two men were out and Garrett was alone in the room with 6 people who had varying and significant reasons to be angry with him, Garrett said, "This doesn't change the timeline." "No," Celine said, "but it changes who controls it." She crossed the room and stood in front of him. She was shorter than him by 4 inches, and it didn't matter at all. "Tell me what Hale knows about the third copy." Garrett looked at her. "He knows it exists. He doesn't know who has it." "What's his theory?" "His theory is it's with someone from your past, someone from before you, were Celine Vale." Garrett's jaw moved. "He's running every name adjacent to the operation 11 years ago. Every person who was in proximity. He has a list. He has 43 names." Celine turned and looked at Lucian. "The person who has the third copy is on that list." Lucien was already on his phone. She turned back to Garrett. "What's Hale's timeline for moving on the list?" "He started an hour ago." "An hour. 43 names." She didn't know how many people he had working it, but if he'd started an hour ago and was working fast, he'd have the list narrowed significantly by now. The third copy was with a woman named Diane Marsh, who had been part of the intelligence-adjacent network 11 years ago, and who had, since then, retired to a quiet life in a mid-sized city 400 miles away. A life roughly as deliberately modest as Celine's had been. Diane didn't know what she was holding. She just knew that if she ever received a particular 3-word text message, she was to upload the contents of a specific encrypted drive to an address Celine had given her and then leave her house for a week. Celine had not sent the text message because she'd been trying to negotiate instead of escalate. That window had closed. She pulled out her phone and typed 3 words and sent them. Then she looked at the time. Diane was careful. Diane would see the message and move within minutes. The upload would take 7 minutes on a good connection. Add transfer time, processing, delivery. 20 minutes, maybe 25, before the files were somewhere Hale couldn't intercept them. She needed 20 minutes where Hale's people weren't on Diane's doorstep. "Is Diane Marsh on the list?" she said to Garrett. He looked at her. "Who?" "Don't," she said. His jaw worked. "I don't know the specific names he's prioritizing. I know the methodology." He paused. "Women in the network are low priority. His theory skews toward men with existing infrastructure." It wasn't a clean answer. It was the honest answer of a man who was being carefully truthful within the limits of what he actually knew. She filed it. Lucien finished his call. "I have someone watching the transmission point. If anything moves on Diane's location, we'll know in 2 minutes." "And then what?" Ness said from the doorway. It wasn't a challenge, it was a real question. Nobody answered it immediately because the answer was the question everyone in the room had been sitting under since the previous night. And then what? The infrastructure was burned. The network's trusted circle had a hole in it the size of Garrett. Hale was running 43 names with an hour's head start. Vega was still somewhere in the background with his own agenda. And the 12-hour window that wasn't a concession was ticking. Lucien said, "We stopped being reactive." Celine looked at him. "Every move since last night has been response," he said. "The ballroom, Connecticut, the warehouse. We've been moving where they pushed us." He stood up from the position he'd held at the table. "Hale wants the files. Vega wants you. Those are 2 separate problems, and we've been treating them as one." He looked at Celine. "Vega doesn't know about the files. Vega just wants to know who you are and why you matter. What happens if Vega finds out what Hale is carrying?" Celine went still. "Tiverton wasn't just Hale," Lucien said. "The consortium behind him. The portfolio group that funded 3 networks. Vega is one of those networks." She said, "Vega's financing ran through Tiverton. Partially, in the early years before he had enough autonomous capital." Lucien's voice was even. "If Vega finds out that Hale is sitting on documentation that connects Vega's early funding to the Tiverton fraud, Vega doesn't want to acquire Hale's leverage. Vega wants to eliminate it." "Which means Vega wants the files destroyed," Celine said. "Which means Hale and Vega are about to have a conflict of interest," Lucien said. "And conflicts of interest between men like that don't stay theoretical for long." Garrett, who had been very quiet, said, "You're going to use Vega against Hale." Nobody acknowledged him. Celine said, "We need to get the information to Vega before Hale finds out we've done it. If Hale knows we've tipped Vega, he'll move faster on the files and on Diane. How fast can you get a message to Vega's organization?" Celine thought about the early morning phone call, the car that had been offered, the voice that had said, "You're already involved." 20 minutes, she said, "maybe less." "Do it." She was already dialing. The next hour was the kind of hour that doesn't feel like 60 minutes. It feels like a series of very short windows between which things happen that change the next window. Celine made the call to a number she'd been given by a third party years ago and held but never used. The number connected to a man who identified himself only by a first name and listened to what she said without interrupting and asked 2 clarifying questions, and then said he would pass the information up and disconnected. Lucien Cien moved his remaining people into positions that covered the building's approaches. Not many people. The trusted circle was thin now, 5 including Ness and Carver, and 2 others whose reliability Lucian could verify personally. 5 was not an army. 5 was enough for a building if the building wasn't surrounded. Damon Cross came in from the alley at 12:40 with Carver, who had apparently decided that leaving him in the car indefinitely was impractical. He came into the main room with the careful look of a man entering a space he doesn't have a role in and isn't sure he's welcome. He looked at Celine. She looked back. "Anything I can do?" he said. Not a question exactly. She said, "There's a laptop on the table. Garrett put 3 things into this network this morning that were compromised. I need someone to go through the communication logs from the last 18 hours and pull every transmission that routed through Garrett's relay node." She looked at him. "You're a finance man. You know how to read data structures." "I know how to read data structures," he said. "Then sit down." He sat down and opened the laptop and started working, and Celine turned back to Lucien and the problem of the next 20 minutes. Vega moved faster than she'd expected. At 1:15 a.m., Lucien's phone rang, and the caller was not someone from Vega's organization passing a message. It was Marco Vega himself. Lucien put it on speaker. The room went very quiet. "Moretti," Vega said. His voice in the small hours of the morning was the same as it had been described to Celine, unhurried, with the particular weight of a man who was used to being the calmest person in any conversation. "I'm told you have documentation connecting Edmund Hale to the Tiverton accounts." "We have documentation connecting the Tiverton accounts to a number of parties," Lucien said. "Hale is one." A pause. "I don't appreciate the implication." "I'm not implying anything. I'm telling you that a file exists, that Hale is currently attempting to suppress it, and that suppressing it requires eliminating everyone who knows what's in it." Lucien's voice was even. "Which is a longer list than Hale has been led to believe." Another pause. Longer. "What do you want?" "Hale," Lucien said. "His location. His current operation. Whatever your people have found in the last hour since you started looking. And in exchange. The entries in the documentation that connect to your early accounts get sealed separately. They don't go to the prosecutor with the rest of the package." A silence that lasted long enough that Celine counted her own heartbeats. 8 of them. "Hale is operating out of a facility on the south waterfront," Vega said. "Pier 11. He moved there 2 hours ago from a secondary location. He has 12 people on site." A pause. "And Moretti, he has a problem you don't know about yet." Lucien and Celine looked at each other. "What problem?" Lucien said. "The woman you sent the files to, Diane Marsh." A pause. "Hale's people reached her location 40 minutes ago. She uploaded the files before they got inside, but they have her." The room went cold. Celine took 1 step forward. "Is she alive?" "As of 20 minutes ago. Hale's using her as a secondary pressure point. He knows the files are in transit, but he doesn't know the delivery address." Another pause. "He's betting you'll trade the destination for her safety." Celine said, "He's right." Lucien's hand came up. Not a stop gesture, more the reflex of a man who wants to interrupt an equation. She shook her head at him. "Tell your people to stand down from Pier 11, she said to the phone. "This stays between us." Vega said, "The documentation gets processed as agreed." She looked at Lucien. He held her eyes for 3 seconds and then nodded. "You'll have confirmation through an independent channel within 72 hours. Vega disconnected. The room breathed. Damon said from the laptop without looking up, "Pier 11 is 4 miles from here." "I know," Lucien said. "He has 12 people." "I know." Damon looked up from the screen. "I found something in the logs." He turned the laptop. Garrett's relay node. He wasn't just routing communications. He was pulling architectural data, floor plans, entry points, security positions for this building. He paused. "But there's a second destination in the routing, a secondary recipient that wasn't Hale's network signature." Celine came to the table and looked at the screen. "Vega," she said. "Yes," Damon said. Garrett had been feeding both of them. Not just Hale, Vega as well. Playing both sides of a war he was positioned between, selling the same building's vulnerabilities to 2 different buyers. Celine looked at Garrett. Garrett had been watching her come to this conclusion from across the room, and he'd had the time to prepare his expression, but preparation only goes so far. What was underneath wasn't guilt. It was the particular exposed quality of a man whose calculation has been fully understood and who knows it. You sold the building to both of them, Celine said. I sold information, Garrett said. That's what I do. You sold Lucian's people. I sold a position in a conflict I didn't start. His voice was steady, but the steadiness was maintained, not natural. Hale was going to find this building regardless. Vega was going to push on Moretti's organization regardless. I made sure that when they did, I was on the useful side. Lucian looked at Garrett for a long time. Then he said to Carver, "Take him downstairs." Garrett didn't fight it. He walked with Carver to the door and stopped and looked back at Celine. Pier 11, he said. The south loading bay. The structural weakness is the east wall. It's a retrofit. The load-bearing elements are exposed. If you need a fast way in and out that isn't the main approaches, that's it. Celine looked at him. Why? She said. Because Hale has Diane Marsh, he said. And whatever else I've done, I don't sell women to men like Hale. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he left with Carver. The room was very quiet. Do you believe him? Ness said. About the east wall? Celine said. We'll find out. She looked at Lucien. He was already pulling on his jacket. 5 people, she said, against 12 in a defended position. And surprise, he said, and the east wall, and Diane Marsh in the middle of it. Yes. He looked at her. You want to tell me not to come? I know better than to waste the breath, she said. He almost smiled. Almost. The car's in the front lot. Service alley, she said. Front lot is burned. They went out through the service door into the alley, and the night was cold and still, and the city made its distant sounds above and around them. Carver and Ness and 2 others, a man named Cole, who moved like someone with military background, and a woman named Reyes adjacent, who Lucian called simply Park, fell into formation without being told. Damon came out behind them. Celine turned. No. I found Garrett's routing data, Damon said. I can read whatever they have at Pier 11. Systems, communications, anything digital. You might need that. You're not trained for I know. He held her eyes. I know I'm not trained. I know this isn't my world. I know I spent 6 years not looking at you, and now I'm standing in an alley asking to come with you, and it probably looks like guilt. He paused. It is guilt, but it's also the only thing I can do that might actually help. Celine looked at him for a moment. The cut on his forehead, the torn collar, the particular expression of a man who is not pretending to be something he isn't. You stay with Ness, she said. Whatever she tells you, you do. Without arguing and without thinking, you know better. Understood, he said. They went to the cars. Pier 11 was 4 miles south, and they had no time and 12 people at the other end of it. And somewhere inside that building, Diane Marsh, who had never asked for any of this, who had lived quietly for 11 years holding an encrypted drive she didn't understand, was sitting in the specific terrified patience of someone who had sent the upload and was now waiting to find out what the upload had cost her. Celine got in the car and looked at the road ahead. Lucien was in the passenger seat. He looked at her sideways. When we get in, he said, Diane is the priority. I know. Before Hale. Before anything else. I know, Lucien. He looked back at the road. I just needed to say it. I know that too, she said. Carver drove. The city moved past the windows in the particular way it moves at 1 in the morning, everything lit but nothing crowded, the bones of the place visible without the flesh of its daytime population. 4 miles felt like 4 minutes and like an hour simultaneously. At 3 blocks out, Celine said, Lights off. Carver killed the headlights. They rolled on in the dark, the waterfront coming up on the right, the smell of it through the ventilation, salt and diesel, and the specific cold of open water at night. Pier 11 was a long, low structure built against the water's edge, with a loading apron running the length of its south face and a series of roll-up doors and personnel entries along the apron. From 3 blocks out, she could see the light from inside leaking under the roll-up doors in thin lines. Could see the positions of the exterior personnel. 2 on the apron, 1 on the roofline, 1 at the north corner. 4 visible. 8 inside. She looked at the east wall. Even from this distance, in this light, she could see what Garrett had described. The east wall of Pier 11 was newer than the rest of the building. Lighter colored concrete block where the rest was brick, the retrofit seam visible even in the dark. She thought about Garrett saying, "I don't sell women to men like Hale." She thought about people surprising her, and then she put that away and looked at the building and thought about nothing but the building. "East wall," she said. "Carver and Cole take the apron positions. The two on the south face. Park takes the north corner. Ness and Damon hold the vehicle and cover the north exit. Lucien and I go through the east wall." "Through," Lucien said. "There's a vehicle in the alley," she said. "We use it to breach." He looked at where she was looking, looked at the east wall, looked at the vehicle, a heavy panel van sitting in the alley between Pier 11 and the adjacent structure. Looked back at her. "That's not subtle," he said. "No," she said. "It isn't." She looked at the building one more time. Diane Marsh was somewhere inside it, with 8 of Hale's people and Edmund Hale himself. And Hale knew the files were uploading, and he knew he was running out of time to pressure anyone into stopping them. And a man who knows he's running out of time becomes a man who makes fast decisions. And fast decisions made by a man like Edmund Hale tended to remove the variables he couldn't control. She needed to move now. "On my count," she said, and her voice was steady, and her hands were steady, and the thing inside her chest that had been tightening for the last 24 hours was still tightening, but the tightening felt different now. Not fear, not exactly, more the specific compression of everything narrowing to a single point, a single moment, the moment that all the other moments had been building toward. She counted. At 3, Carver opened his door. At 2, Cole was already moving low along the alley wall. At 1, Lucien reached across and put his hand on her arm for exactly 1 second. No words, just the pressure of it, the contact of a person who has been looking for you for a very long time and found you and is not going to lose you in the next 60 seconds if any of the variables are within his control. She looked at him. He let go. She opened the door and moved into the cold dark toward the van and the east wall and the thin lines of light leaking under the doors of Pier 11. And behind her she heard the sounds of the plan beginning, footsteps, a door, the particular held breath quality of people moving in coordinated silence toward a reckoning that had been building for 11 years and had run out of room to keep building and had finally, irrevocably arrived. The van hit the east wall at 41 miles per hour, and the wall did what Garrett said it would do. It gave. The retrofit concrete block cracked at the seam line, and the center section pushed inward in one piece, the van's front end punching through and stopping half embedded in the gap, headlights blazing into the interior of Pier 11 with the sudden violent light of something that was never supposed to be open. Celine was out of the passenger door before the van stopped rocking, dropping to the concrete floor inside the breach, gun up, moving left to clear the blind spot at the van's flank. The interior of Pier 11 was one large open floor with a mezzanine level running along the north wall, accessed by a metal staircase on the far end. The work lamps were stronger here than at the warehouse, 4 of them on stands, lighting the center of the floor where a table had been set up, equipment on it, a laptop, cables, the infrastructure of a man who was running an operation rather than just holding ground. Celine registered all of this in approximately 2 seconds because the first 2 of Hale's inside people were already moving, and moving people required immediate attention. She took the near one, the man coming from the left, who had his weapon clearing his holster but hadn't fully acquired a target. She fired once, low, and he went down at the knee and stayed down loudly. The second one had cover behind a pillar and was trained, taking his time, which was the more dangerous kind. She moved right, drawing his angle, and Lucy came through the breach on the van's other side and took the pillar from the opposite direction, and the man behind it ran out of geometry. 2 down, 6 more inside, and Edmund Hale and Diane Marsh. From outside she could hear the apron engagement, Carver and Cole moving on the exterior positions, the sounds of it brief and efficient. Park's position went quiet fast, which meant fast or very bad, and she didn't have bandwidth to determine which. She moved toward the mezzanine staircase. Lucien's hand caught her elbow. He pointed up. On the mezzanine level, visible through the metal grating of the floor above, a figure was moving, not toward the staircase, away from it, moving toward the north end of the mezzanine where the shadows were deepest. Edmund Hale. She knew the movement, that deliberate, unhurried quality, even now. Diane's on this level, she said, low, fast. He wouldn't keep her up there, but too exposed. She's in the back. Lucien said, go, I'll take the stairs. She went. The back of Pier 11 was partitioned by old wooden dividers, the bones of whatever the space had been before Hale repurposed it for the night. She moved through the first partition gap and found two of Hale's people, stationed, waiting, positioned for exactly this approach. The first one she anticipated because he breathed wrong, too controlled, the breath of someone holding still on purpose. She came in under his line of sight, and the encounter was close and brutal and fast, and left her with a cut on her left forearm from the edge of something she didn't see in time and him on the floor. The second one was behind a stack of old industrial shelving. He made his move when she was still dealing with the first, and she took his weight on her shoulder and drove him into the shelving, the whole structure coming down with the two of them inside the sound of it, metal on concrete. She came up first. He didn't come up. Her arm was bleeding through her sleeve. Not arterial. She checked automatically. The press of two fingers, the rate, surface cut, deep enough to sting, not deep enough to matter yet. She kept moving. Behind the second partition, in a space that had probably been an office once, Diane Marsh was zip-tied to a support column with her hands behind her. She was conscious. That was the first thing. The thing Cellini's chest released on. Conscious and looking at the door with an expression that had moved past fear into the specific exhausted alertness of someone who has been afraid for long enough that the fear has gone flat. She saw Celine. She said, "You took your time." Celine crossed the room and cut the zip ties with the knife she'd taken off the first man. Diane's hands came forward and she pressed them together and flexed her fingers with the involuntary wince of returning circulation. "Can you walk?" Celine said. "I've been sitting, not running a marathon." Diane stood. She was in her early 50s, gray at the temples, the kind of practical solidity that came from a decade of quiet living after years of something else. She looked at Celine's arm. "You're cut." "I know." "How bad?" "Not bad. Walk." Diane walked. They came back through the partition into the main floor and found it changed. 3 of Hale's inside people were down or controlled. Carver had come through a side door and was covering the east breach point. Cole was at the south wall. Park was sitting against the north pillar with one hand pressed to his ribs, breathing in short pulls, still functional but not moving fast. Not very bad. Not good either. From the mezzanine, sounds of contact. Not gunfire, something more physical. The sounds of 2 people in a space too small for the kind of distance that requires shooting. Celine handed Diane to Carver. "Get her to the vehicle." She went to the staircase. The mezzanine was a narrow walkway 12 feet above the main floor, metal grating underfoot, the rail along the open edge old pipe welded in place. At the north end, Lucien and Hale were in the specific close geometry of 2 men who had gotten past the point where weapons were useful and were now managing each other at arm's length. Hale was stronger than he looked. That was the first thing she saw coming up the stairs. His age read as frailty until you watched him move, and then you understood that he was a man who had kept himself in the kind of shape that wasn't about appearance but about utility. He had Lucien against the north wall with one forearm across his throat and was using his weight and the wall to manage the equation. Lucien's face was dark with the effort of breathing against the pressure. His hands were on Hale's forearm, not pulling, pushing, trying to create angle, change the geometry. Celine came off the top stair and crossed the mezzanine in 6 steps. Hale heard her. He turned his head, that composed face even now, even in this, and he said, "Stop." She didn't stop. "I'll increase the pressure," he said. "Right now. You know what that does to the vessels." She stopped. 8 feet away. The mezzanine was narrow enough that she could see Lucien's face clearly. His eyes found hers. He was calculating something. She could see it, the lateral thinking of a man who is being choked and is refusing to spend his remaining oxygen on panic. Hale said, "The transmission destination. Right now. Or this ends here." The files are already delivered, she said. They arrived 11 minutes ago. To where? To 3 separate federal offices in 2 jurisdictions. The moment you walked into this pier, the 48-hour contingency accelerated. She held his eyes. There is no transmission to stop. It's done. Hale looked at her. That recalculating look. The look she'd seen in the warehouse. The same engine behind the same careful face. He was checking her for tells, the way he'd been trained to, the way she'd been trained to. You're lying, he said. I'm not, she said. Call it. Look at my face and call it. He looked. She gave him everything. Not the flat effect of someone suppressing, but the open expression of someone who has nothing left to suppress because the thing is done. His forearm pressure didn't increase, but it didn't release either. Even if that's true, he said, I still have what's in my hand. You have a man who's been looking for me for 11 years, she said. Let him go and walk out of this building, and I will tell the attorneys who received the files that your cooperation in the investigation was instrumental. You won't avoid accountability, but you'll have a conversation instead of a cell. That's not an offer. It's the only offer there is. She let a breath out slowly. Edmund, it's over. The files are out. Diane is out. Your network has a hole in it from Vega's people, and from mine, and from a federal interest that's been building a file on the Tiverton Consortium for 4 years, independently of anything I gave them. She watched his face. You've been running for a long time. You're tired. I can see it. Something moved in his face. Not weakness. Not quite. The thing underneath the composure. The human thing that composure is built to cover. He was 68 years old, and he was on a mezzanine in a pier in the middle of the night, holding a man's life in his forearm, and he was tired. She saw the exact moment he decided. His forearm released. Lucien pulled air in hard, one raw breath, then controlled himself, because Lucien was the kind of man who controlled himself, and stepped away from the wall with one hand braced on the railing. Hale lowered his arm. He looked at Celine with an expression that was not quite defeat and not quite acceptance, and was probably the closest thing to honest she'd ever seen on his face. My parents, she said. Tell me their names. He looked at her. You knew them, she said. You were adjacent to what happened to them. Tell me their names. A pause. Miriam and Joseph, he said. Miriam and Joseph Vanek. The names in his mouth were both terrible and necessary. She'd been carrying those names for 22 years and hearing someone else say them, someone who had known them in the context of their ending rather than their living, was a particular kind of pain that she hadn't prepared for and couldn't have. She breathed through it. Who gave the order? She said. A man named Corvin. He's been dead for 9 years. Hale held her eyes. I can give you the documentation, the full chain, in exchange for what you offered. You'll give me the documentation regardless, she said, as part of the accounting you owe. The exchange was already made downstairs. She held his gaze. But I'm asking you to tell me now. As a person, not as a transaction. Hale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Corvin ran the consortium's enforcement arm in the early years. Your father found a discrepancy in a financial audit. He was going to report it. Corvin moved to prevent the report. A pause. Your mother was collateral. That's how he would have described it. His voice was flat, not cruel. The flatness of a man reporting facts he'd lived with long enough that they no longer required emotional management. I found out afterward. I should have done something with that knowledge. I didn't. She looked at him for a long time. No, she said. You didn't. She stepped back, gave him room. He looked at her once more with that tired face, then turned toward the staircase and walked down it and across the floor of Pier 11 and out through the side door, and 2 of Lucien's people fell in on either side of him, and the door closed behind them. Lucien was beside her. His throat would bruise by morning. She could already see the redness. He was breathing normally, or close to it. Corvin, he said, dead 9 years. She looked at the empty floor below them. It doesn't fix anything? No, he said. But you know, that's different from not knowing. She thought about that. Thought about 22 years of carrying a shape without a name, the way certain griefs stay shapeless because the information needed to define them was never available. It wasn't resolution. Resolution was a word that belonged to stories cleaner than this one. What it was definition. The thing had a shape now, a name, a chain. That was different from not knowing. He was right about that. They came down the stairs together, and the main floor of Pier 11 was in the particular aftermath state of a space where something violent happened and then stopped. Equipment overturned, the work lamps still running, two of Hale's people zip-tied to the pillar where they'd been managed, the others gone or removed. Carver was at the breach in the east wall, looking at the damage with the practical assessment of a man cataloging what will need explaining. Park was still against the north pillar. He looked up when Celine crossed toward him. His hand was still at his ribs. "Cracked," he said, reading her look. "Not broken. I've had broken. This is cracked. Can you move?" "Already did," he said, and pushed himself upright with one hand and only clenched his jaw once. They went out through the breach in the east wall, all of them, through the gap the van had made, and the waterfront night was cold and clear, and the harbor was a flat black surface with the city's lights scattered on it in moving pieces. Diane Marsh was in the vehicle with Ness and Damon. When Celine opened the door, Diane looked at her, and Celine looked at Diane, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was too much to say, and this was not the moment for it. Then Diane said, "The drive. I got the upload." "I know. All of it. I know, Diane." Celine put her hand on the woman's arm briefly, the press of it, the only thing she had to offer right now. "Thank you." Diane looked out the window at the harbor. 11 years I kept that drive in a shoebox under a floorboard, she said. Felt stupid every time I thought about it. A pause. "Doesn't feel stupid now." "No," Celine said. "It doesn't, so..." Damon was in the back seat on the other side of Diane. He was looking at Celine with an expression she'd seen develop over the course of the last 24 hours. Not the expression of the man in the ballroom, not the face of someone performing confidence in a room full of people he needed to impress. Something quieter than that. Something that had been sitting under the performance for a long time and had finally come to the surface when the performance stopped being available. "The routing data," he said. "I sent it to 2 of the federal contacts in the files before we left the building. Time-stamped, source verified. It documents Garrett's relay activity and connects it to Hale's network directly." Celine looked at him. "You said I could be useful," he said. "I said you might be," she said. "Close enough." He looked at his hands. "Is it over?" She thought about Hale in the custody of Lucian's people, about the files in 3 federal offices, about Vega, who had made a calculation and would spend the next several years being very carefully quiet because quiet was now his best option. About Garrett, downstairs in Lucian's building, who had given her the east wall when he didn't have to, which didn't balance the ledger, but was a line in it. "This part," she said. "Yes." The cars pulled away from Pier 11 and the waterfront fell behind them, and the city opened up again around them with its ordinary indifference, its traffic lights cycling through colors for nobody, its buildings full of people sleeping through the end of something they'd never know happened. Lucien rode in silence beside Carver. Celine watched the city from the back seat and thought about what came next in the way you can only think about it when the emergency is over and the mind has room again for the future tense. The next several weeks moved slowly. This was intentional. The federal process moved at the pace federal processes move. Not fast, never fast, but with the specific momentum of something that, once started, doesn't easily stop. The Tiverton files landed in the hands of people who had been building toward this corner of the same investigation from a different angle, and the convergence of the 2 threads created something more complete than either had been alone. Hale's cooperation, as agreed, was documented. It didn't keep him out of a room with prosecutors, but it shaped the room's temperature. Vega retracted. This was the word Lucien used, and it was accurate. Not a defeat, not a surrender, but the specific strategic withdrawal of a man who had reassessed the costs and found them prohibitive. His expansion into Lucian's territory stopped. His interest in Celine stopped. He became, overnight and permanently, a man who had never heard of any of this. Garrett spent 48 hours in a conversation with Lucian that Celine was not present for and did not ask about. Whatever was said in that conversation, its result was that Garrett left the city and did not return. and the documentation he provided about his relay activity was included in the federal package under a sealed arrangement that Lucien's attorneys negotiated. Lucien spent the weeks after Pier 11 doing something that surprised the people who'd worked with him longest. He began the process of dissolution, not of himself, but of the operational structure that had been the mechanism of his authority for 2 decades. Not quickly, not publicly. He moved legitimate capital into legitimate ventures, restructured reporting relationships, transferred certain activities to people who were positioned to run them above the line rather than below it. He did this methodically, with the attention to detail that had always characterized everything he did, except that now the detail was pointed in a different direction. He told Celine about it one evening in a restaurant that was not a venue chosen for security or discretion, but simply because the food was good. She sat across from him and listened. It was always going to end, he said. The question was whether it ended by someone else's hand or mine. You're choosing yours, she said. I'm choosing mine. He looked at his coffee cup. Some of it can't be made clean. I know that. I'm not trying to make it clean. I'm trying to make what comes after it something I can stand behind. She looked at him. In the restaurant light, he looked like what he was. A man in his early 50s who had lived hard and thought carefully and made decisions he'd spent years living inside of. Not a villain, not a hero. Something more ordinary and more complicated than either. What does that look like, she said. What you can stand behind. I don't know yet, he said. I'm still building the picture. He looked at her. What does yours look like? She thought about it honestly, which she hadn't let herself do in a long time. The future as a real thing rather than a contingency. She'd been living in contingency for 11 years. In the architecture of if-then, always planning the exit before settling into the room. A job, she said. A real one. Not the paralegal thing. That was always cover. Something that uses what I actually know. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. Advocacy, maybe. There are organizations that work with fraud victims, pension fraud specifically, people who lost everything to schemes like Tiverton. She looked at the table. I know more about how those schemes work than most people who work those cases. I know the mechanics from the inside. Lucien was quiet for a moment. That would be useful work. Yes, she said. It would. And difficult. Yes. She looked up at him. I'm not afraid of difficult. He looked at her with the particular expression she'd been cataloging since the ballroom. The one that had something unguarded in it, something that didn't perform. I know, he said. I never thought you were. They sat in the restaurant until the second round of coffee went cold, and the conversation moved into the ordinary. The specific relief of talking about things that weren't emergencies. They were not easy with each other the way people who've never been tested are easy. They were easy the way people are easy when they've been tested enough times that the pretense has been burned off, and what's left is just what's actually there. It wasn't simple. It wasn't going to be. She found, sitting in that restaurant, that she didn't need it to be. She met Damon Cross for the last time in a coffee shop he'd suggested, 6 weeks after Pier 11. He was different in a way that was hard to name, and she spent the first few minutes trying to name it before she stopped trying and just accepted it. The performance was gone. The particular pitched-forward energy of a man who needed to be the most significant person in the room, gone, or at least dialed down to something manageable, something that didn't take up all the air. He looked like someone who'd had a hard month and was still in the middle of deciding what to do with what it had taught him. I'm leaving the firm, he said. Not being pushed out, leaving. He wrapped his hands around his mug. I've been thinking about what I actually want to build, rather than what looks like success. Those are different things, she said. They're very different things. He looked at her. I spent 6 years with you and didn't look at you. I mean that literally. I saw the shape of you without looking at the actual person. He paused. I'm not asking you to forgive that. I'm not asking for anything. I needed to say it where it landed, not just where it felt good to say. She looked at him across the table. The cut on his forehead had healed to a pale line. He'd gotten a haircut, something less precise than his old style, something that fit his face better. It landed, she said. He nodded. Something in him settled. "Will you be all right?" she said. "Eventually." He almost smiled. "I've been wrong about most things." "That's actually useful information if you're willing to sit with it." He looked at his mug. "Carter sends his regards. He wants you to know that November is now his favorite word in the English language." She laughed. It came out of her without her managing it, which was its own small thing. The laugh of a person who had not laughed reflexively in a long time. Damon looked at her when she laughed, and his expression was complicated and honest and held nothing that wanted anything from her. "Take care of yourself," he said. "You too," she said. He left first. She sat with her coffee for another 10 minutes and watched the ordinary life of the coffee shop move around her. A woman with a stroller, two men arguing about something on a laptop, a teenager with headphones who hadn't looked up in the entire time she'd been sitting there. The ordinary world, unremarkable and continuous and indifferent to what it had taken to be sitting inside it this particular morning. She thought about Miriam and Joseph Vanek, whose names she could now say without the word parents preceding them, because they were people who had existed and not just a loss she'd been carrying. She thought about what Hale had told her on the mezzanine. Her father, the audit, the discrepancy that had cost them everything. Her father had found something wrong and decided to report it. That was who he'd been. A man who found something wrong and decided to report it. She could do something with that. She'd been doing something with it for 11 years without knowing what to call it. She knew what to call it now. She paid for her coffee and walked out into the city. And the morning was cold and clear, the kind of cold that makes the air feel like it has edges, and the city moved around her with its traffic and its noise and its 10,000 simultaneous lives that would never intersect with hers. She walked, not toward anything specific, just walked, through the city she'd lived in for 6 years while pretending not to know it too well. Through streets she'd memorized for exit routes and was now just walking, because the morning was cold and her coffee was warm in her chest, and she wasn't going anywhere particular and hadn't needed to be anywhere particular for the first time in a very long time. Her phone buzzed. "Lucien, dinner tonight. That place with the unremarkable name on the east side, 7 o'clock. She looked at the message, typed back, "The food isn't worth the parking." His reply came in 12 seconds. "I know. Come anyway." She put the phone in her pocket and kept walking. The city moved around her. The cold moved through her. And somewhere in the city, in offices that smelled like recycled air and burned coffee, federal attorneys were opening files that had her father's name in them, and her mother's name, and the names of the people who had decided that those names were acceptable costs, and those names were going to be read aloud in rooms where it mattered. It wasn't enough. Nothing was ever going to be exactly enough. But it was real, and it was done, and it had been done by the person who needed to do it. She turned a corner, and the sun came over a building and hit her directly, the low winter sun that is more light than warmth, but is something anyway. She stopped for a moment and let it sit on her face. Then she kept walking. The story of the woman who made the most feared man on the East Coast kneel in a ballroom full of witnesses moved through the underworld the way certain stories move. Not as fact exactly, not as legend exactly, but as something in between, something people passed along because it said something true about how power actually worked, which was not the way most people with power wanted it understood. The story was this. A man with armies at his disposal had spent 11 years looking for one woman, not for leverage, not for control, because she had walked toward danger to help him when she didn't have to, and then walked away without asking for anything, and that had turned out to be the only thing in his life he couldn't account for, or replace, or build a structure around. When people told the story, they usually ended it with the ballroom, the kneeling, the image of it. But the end wasn't the ballroom. The end was a woman walking through a city on a cold morning with her hands in her pockets, not running from anything, not managing anything, not building an exit or checking the angles or listening for the wrong sound in an elevator, just walking, choosing, for the first time in a very long time, what came next. That was the end. That was the part worth knowing.